Welcome to the NT Zone. This is Dale, and I'm talking about a very interesting topic. People talk about introversion and extroversion, but I'm going to focus on introversion. But some people say they know what introverts are. They say, I don't talk to people a lot. I must be an introvert. Well, I guess so, if we're going by definitions, which are quite insufficient. In fact, there are actually people called people with social anxiety and people with schizoid, I think it was affective disorder, but basically people who would be hurt by social interaction in one way or another, but that does not make them introverts. In fact, social anxiety can actually happen to extroverts. And in fact, it might even be a telltale sign of a type of extrovert who has been beaten up by life. In fact, if we're talking about introversion and extroversion from this type of idea, we can see so many flaws with it. But let's not go there. I would like to talk about introversion and extroversion from the guy who basically talked about this type of thing, Carl Jung. And what can we actually learn? What is introversion? What is extroversion? But extroversion will be for the next video, so keep subscribed. So, introversion, inwardness. It's one of the two different dichotomies which divide Jung's four functions into two typal attitudes. Now, or typical attitudes. Now, if we look at modern man in search of a soul, it is in I probably should have saved this, but it's in page 86. Introversion or extroversion as a typical attitude means an essential bias which conditions the whole psychic process, establishes the habitual reactions, and thus determines not only the style of behavior but also the nature of the subjective experience. And not only so, but it also denotes a kind of compensatory activity, sorry about that, of the unconscious, which we might expect to find. When the habitual reactions are determined, we can feel fairly certain of having hit the mark because they govern external behavior on one hand and on the other mold specific experience. A certain kind of behavior brings corresponding results, and the subjective understanding of these results gives rise to experiences which in turn influences behavior, and thus the circle of an individual's destiny. So there we have it. Typical attitudes, biases. So what does this mean? We basically prefer to use, and we consistently use, this function in that way or not. So for those who don't know Jungian theory or have any knowledge of MBTI or socionics or any of the systems that use the functions, you have thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. Now, we're going to divide these up a little bit. So, thinking and feeling. Think about that. What does this detail? Thinking and feeling give us judgments. They are judgment functions. They make you think. They make you decide things, and in that way they are rational. Now, sensation and intuition. Now, sensation and intuition, they are perception. They are not rational. They are simply perception. They are not rational in the sense, not of irrational, of stupidity. They are not rational in the sense that they are not used for rational judgments. In fact, a perceptive function basically just gives us this idea that we should basically just perceive things. We're looking at the data. We are gathering experience and so on. And of course, intuition and sensation are involved. Now, I'm not going to go over these things in detail now because they will be better in detail later when I talk about the individual functions or even within as it corresponds to type. But just to give a quick rundown, thinking deals with critical judgment. And what is a critical judgment? It's basically looking at the facts, which is extroverted thinking. Focusing on the facts. What empirical data can lead me? What can I pull? What's everyone's opinion? Okay, so I'm going to use the science to try to get there. And introverted thinking is, of course, the idea of looking for principles. I'm going to divide things up. I'm going to critique this. I'm going to critique that. I'm going to look at the concepts, how they connect logically, and so on, through trusting my intelligence. You see right here, we already have this division right here. So the extroverted thinker, he goes out, he looks for all these different opinions, he looks for all these different facts primarily, and he brings them together, and he's open to different ideas in the sense of a scientist. Whereas an introverted thinker, he trusts his own reason. Immanuel Kant, the guy who is an INTP, or the standard INTP, the archetypical INTP, he basically talks about the Enlightenment as simple à dire. I'm not sure if I pronounced it right, but well, you just tell me in the comments if you want to correct my pronunciation. But this means basically dare to be wise. This is introverted thinking. I will trust my reasoning. And yes, by the way, people will use both. But when it comes to a introverted thinking dominant or an extroverted thinking dominant, the primary function in play is what they prefer, which is introverted or extroverted thinking. And what is a type more than a basically the idea of the predominance of one function? So some will disagree, of course. I've known some people who will dispute that there are 16 types. That's for another video. I'm not going to talk about that here. Yes, you look at the type through like the general ego structure, or you can look at the type through the predominance of a function, which is what Jung did. And it's auxiliary and inferior and so on. But that's for a different video. But let's get into the perception, and we'll see it. For the most part, Sensation is about the real. It's about the here and now. Um, they are correspondent to C.S. Pierce, the pragmatist philosopher. In one of his essays, talks about internal sensation as time, external sensation as space. Now, there's more to the story. Again, I'm not going to get into it too much. Just know that this is a more of a function or even a type that corresponds to being more connected to what is real, what is here and now, what is most likely in the case of what can be sensed through the senses. Intuition, on the other hand, is more imaginative. Extroverted intuitives are very famous for their ability to look at different possibilities in the external world. Introverted intuitives, they're harder to explain, but they basically have a sort of analogical view of the world. Jung describes in some of his interviews patients that talked about having a snake in their stomach when they were sick to convey the sickness. Of course, this would not be the case with a lot of introverted intuitives in the sense of development. I would like to think that over time they would learn, okay, well, I cannot communicate this symbolic, so I'm going to try to learn other ways of communication to try to show to this other person, okay, well, I see this vision. I see something that you do not see, but how can I communicate with you? So this is how the analogical first develops. Then this is also how they eventually can overcome the analogical. But more of that on a different video. We're talking about introversion. And so right now we have introverted judging and introverted perceiving. By the way, I do not mean this in the sense of the MBTI. In fact, this is not an MBTI video. This is a Jungian video. I'm not talking about IXXJ. I'm not talking about IXXP. When you look through the psychological types, so he talks about these things in detail, but I'll get there in a minute. So what he calls the introverted rational types, also known as introverted judging. Both the foregoing types may be termed rational since they are grounded on the functions of rational judgment. Introverted, by the way, introverted thinking, introverted feeling. Rational judgment is based not merely on objective but also subjective data. So, introversion and extroversion. Objective data, extroversion, introversion, subjective. The predominance of one or the other factor, however, as a result of a psychic disposition often existing from early youth, will give the judgment a corresponding bias. A judgment that is truly rational will appeal to the objective and subjective factor equally and do justice to both. But that would be an ideal case and would presuppose an equal development of both extroversion and introversion. In practice, however, either movement excludes the other, and so long as this dilemma remains, they cannot exist side by side, but as at best successively under ordinary conditions, therefore, and the ideal rationality is possible. The rationality of a rational type always has a typical bias. I was about to say typo, and I think that typo is a good word for it too. Thus, the judgment of the introverted rational types is undoubtedly rational, only that is oriented more by the subjective factor. This does not necessarily imply any logical bias, since bias lies in the premise. The premises consist in the predominance of the subjective factor prior to all conclusions and judgments. The superior value of the subjective as compared with the objective factor appears self-evident from the beginning. It is not a question of assigning this value, but, as we have said, of a natural disposition existing before all rational valuation. Hence, the introvert rational judgment has many nuances which differentiate it from that of the extrovert. To mention only the most general instance, the chain of reasoning that leads to the subjective factor seems to the introvert somewhat more rational than one that leads to the object. This difference, though slight and practically unnoticeable in individual cases, builds up in the end to unbridge the discrepancies which are the more entertaining or irritating, the less one is aware of the minimal shift of the standpoint occasioned by psychological premise. A capital error regularly creeps in here, for instead of recognizing the difference in the premise, one tries to demonstrate a fallacy in the conclusion. This recognition is a difficult matter for every rational type, since it undermines the apparent absolute validity of his own principle and delivers him over to its antithesis, for which to him amounts to a mere catastrophe. The introvert is far more subject to misunderstanding than the extrovert, not so much because the extrovert is a more merciless or critical adversary than he himself might be, but because the style of the times which he himself imitates works against him. So, for the introverted feeler, you get these types of ideas that, or value judgments, which the introverted feeler finds very important. These principles, like very much into these certain principles, which has basically benefited their lives. Basically, that they want to share with others if they can, but they would not force it on others. They want to enjoy it. More on that in a different video. The introverted thinker likes to look at these principles, thinks about them, and thinks about the structure, learns. But finding these principles through logic, through reasoning, can actually also, just like the introverted feeler, enjoy these principles. These principles are very important to the introverted thinker. And we have talked about the differences before when I talked about pragmatism and its influence on Jung. But for here, we can see that the introverted judger is one who basically loves these principles. And it's possible, by the way, for an introvert to start trying their best to develop the extroverted portion. I have myself used what I could to develop both. So as an introverted thinker, I can also now use extroverted thinking. So it's possible. Jung even admits that's possible. But there's a bias still. I would prefer to stay within the realm of be looking for the principle behind things and obsessing over that. I would very much enjoy the facts, very much, hold it in my hands. I would very much love to discuss things, to pull other people about their opinions. But for me, the main thing is the addiction to principles. What type of principles? Critical principles. Value principles, on the other hand, are for the introverted viewers. Okay, so now we're talking about perception, introverted perception. This one's a little bit more difficult. So I'm just going to let Jung talk about it. All right, so summary of the introverted irrational types. The two types just described, that is, introverted sensation, introverted intuition, are almost inaccessible to judgment from the outside. Being introverted and having, in consequence, little capacity or desire for expression, they offer but a frail handle in this respect, as their main activity is directed inwards. Nothing is outwardly visible but reserve, secretiveness, a lack of sympathy, uncertainty, and apparently groundless embarrassment. When anything does come to the surface, it is generally an indirect manifestation of the inferior and relatively unconscious functions. Such manifestations naturally arouse all the current prejudices against this type. Accordingly, they are mostly underestimated, or at least misunderstood, to the extent that they do not understand themselves because they very largely lack judgment. They are also powerless to understand why they are so constantly underestimated by the public. They cannot see that their efforts to be forthcoming are, as a matter of fact, an inferior character. Their vision is enthralled by the richness of the subjective events. What is going on inside of them is so captivating and of such inexhaustible charm that they simply do not notice that the little they do manage to communicate contains hardly anything of what they themselves have experienced. The fragmentary and episodic character of their communication makes too great a demand on the understanding of and goodwill of those around them. Also, their communications are without the personal warmth that alone carries the power of conviction. On the contrary, these types have very often a harsh, repelling manner, though of this they are quite unaware and did not intend it. We shall form a fair judgment of such people and show them greater forbearance. When we begin to realize how hard it is to translate into intelligible language what is perceived within, yet this forbearance must not go so far as to exempt them altogether from the need to communicate. This would only do them great harm. Fate itself prepares for them, perhaps even more than other men, overwhelming external difficulties which have a very sobering effect on those intoxicated by the inner vision. Often it is only an intense personal need that can wring from them a human confession. So, right there you have it. This type is described that way, or these types rather. They cannot communicate very well what they are experiencing as inward. No one else has a easy frame of reference. They can come off certain ways. I know some INTJs, INFJs, ISTJs, ISFJs. They do have some difficulty communicating. In fact, a lot of them are very secretive, as Jung says. A lot of them keep to themselves. They're kind of close to the stereotypical introvert of not going to say anything, um, except for maybe if they are more advanced in years and advanced in experience and found ways to communicate better. So they often, I notice, do have a miscommunication that's so easy. This miscommunication could possibly be fixed, but maybe not. But um, what we see here, the introverts, it's all about inwardness. Some use inward judgments, the feeling, introverted feeling, the introverted thinking. Some use inward perceptions, introverted sensation, introverted intuition, but they're all inward. The subjective factor. What is subjective? It does not mean, in the postmodern sense, doesn't mean that truth, that's your truth, this is my truth. They're both equally correct. No, that's not what it means. It means, in the lines of, I will observe the externals with a inward judgment, or I will judge externally, but inwardly I might perceive. This is very powerful when you look at the basic four function model. The character of the sensation cannot, or not sensation, the character of the perception cannot exist with a intuitive, either as auxiliary or as dominant. So what you would want is to have a thinking or feeling. You have to have a judgment, then perception, because not a contrary character to each other, as opposed to this antagonistic nature of intuition versus sensation. So you have judgment, perception, or perception, judgment. Now what comes next? Okay, perception, judgment, perception. Now after that, judgment, or judgment, perception, judgment, perception. Or no, judgment, perception, perception, judgment. Yeah, sorry about that. This is because, like, how antagonistic things are, how value judgments are not quite the same focus as critical judgment. So you have the strength of feeling and thinking like really strong together. They will conflict each other. So in Jungian idea, you kind of have to have them kind of separate. In fact, a lot of times your introverted thinking has a inferior extroverted feeling. So you already have that. And so if you have the idea of a auxiliary, which is supporting it, it's got to be a perception function, sensation, introverted sensation. No, let's say, just using the typical extroverted sensation or extroverted intuition, then extroverted intuition or introverted extroverted sensation and extroverted intuition has a introverted sensation or introverted intuition, and that's how you get a basic function or function stack. And this video has gone along for a long time, and it's very late. Keep following. The next video is going to be about extroversion. And I have some really great videos planned for the future. So like, comment, subscribe.